CARICOM Heads of Government urged G20 to extend debt suspension initiative. Member States navigating safe reopening of schools in the Trinity term. Welcome to this week's episode of the CARICOM News Time. I'm Tusankin English Francis with the details of those headlines and other interesting developments in the Caribbean community. We begin this week's program with the appeals from CARICOM Heads of Government for the G20 to extend its debt service suspension initiative to further support economic recovery in countries that have experienced above-average GDP declines due to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the United Nations High-Level Meeting on International Debt Architecture and Liquidity on the 29th of March, 4 CARICOM Heads of Government made a case for systematic, urgent, and more comprehensive support to small island developing states. Many of them, Prime Minister Andrew Holness of Jamaica said, are afraid to apply for debt relief because of the threat of credit ratings downgrade.
The elevated debt risk that confront developing countries, particularly those that were already grappling with high debt burdens, require urgent action by the international community. We therefore welcome the efforts made by the G20 to establish the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, which has been extended through June 2021. However, we urge that it be further extended to at least the end of this year and ideally to the end of 2022. While recognizing that many low-income countries are at high risk of debt distress, there are several middle-income countries that are also at risk. Whether they too will fall into distress depends on the depth and duration of the impact of the pandemic. Small island developing states, which are heavily reliant on tourism and remittances, are particularly vulnerable. We therefore call for an expansion of the DSSI to include vulnerable middle-income countries that request debt forbearance.
Convened and led by United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Prime Minister Holness, the meeting was held ahead of the annual meetings of the IMF, the World Bank, the G20, and the G7 meetings, as well as the Financing for Development Forum. In seeking concrete actions to provide liquidity and address debt vulnerability, the event attended to the concern that some countries have been able to add new debt to build a bridge to recovery and reserve vaccines, while others have had to allocate their limited fiscal space to servicing debts rather than supporting their people and recovery.
Fleeing foreign investors and credit rating downgrades have narrowed the policy space of middle-income countries and middle-income small states even further. Developing countries have been unable to spend anywhere near as much as needed to avert massive unemployment and the new poverty. And the new poverty more often than not is reflective in vulnerability, while the new wealth is reflected in resilience. Now is the time for us truly to embrace vulnerability, as the UN Secretary General and many of the other heads of the IFIs have done in their speeches. We need it now in reality as that criteria to determine access.
President of Guyana, Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali, added his voice to the widening economic disparities the COVID-19 pandemic has created between rich and poor countries. He complimented the G20's debt suspension initiative, and he too urged that serious consideration be given to its extension to help poor countries with their recovery efforts.
We advocate for broad-based debt relief to developing countries through international frameworks similar to the Paris Club arrangements, such as the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries, the HIPIC Initiative, and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. Further, we encourage the granting of debt relief by bilateral and commercial creditors, not explicitly participating in debt relief initiatives.
Prime Minister Gaston Brown of Antigua and Barbuda, speaking as chair of the Alliance of Small Island States, highlighted the triple-faceted challenges small island states face with extraordinary public health demands from the pandemic, managing the social and development impacts of its economic devastation, and preparing for the enlarging effects of climate change.
Vaccines should be regarded as a common global good, and they should be allocated fairly and equitably with priority access for the vulnerable. Yet, more than 5 billion vaccines have been bought by wealthy countries, in some cases, more than twice their needs, while small island states within their neighborhood have received minuscule amounts. Now, the Caribbean SIDS are potentially a few months away from their next catastrophic hurricane, and now run the risk of the possible calamitous spread of COVID-19 among unvaccinated individuals clustering in shelters.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pointed out at a joint post-meeting press conference that we are already in the worst global recession in 90 years and that we cannot walk head-on, eyes wide open, into a debt crisis that is foreseeable and preventable.
Fresh financing by international financial institutions, the G20's debt service suspension initiative, and the common framework for debt treatments are welcome steps. But we must go further and faster. The DSSI must be extended into 2022 and made available to all highly indebted countries, including also vulnerable middle-income countries that might request it. The common framework must be complemented with initiatives and instruments so that participating countries are not penalized with downgrades to their credit ratings. Additional targeted debt relief will be needed. Options include debt swaps, buybacks, and cancellations, and the private sector must be brought into the dialogue. In the long term, we need an international debt architecture that works for all, with agreed principles and restructurings that are timely and adequate.
Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, said that we need to learn from the crisis that has deepened others, such as climate change. He said building back better means creating good jobs and growing clean, resilient economies and ensuring no one is left behind.
This comes on top of the economic effects of ongoing emergencies like climate change, which have only been made worse by the pandemic. As a world, we cannot afford to turn away. Instead, we must learn from this crisis and together set ourselves on a better path.
CARICOM member states are navigating how to open schools safely and when, carefully assessing risk to key stakeholders, including students and teachers. Member states including Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Belize, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines have announced their intention to reopen schools, reintroducing more students to face-to-face learning through a phased approach, with the exception of Antigua and Barbuda, which announced full-time reopening of schools on the 12th of April. During a press briefing on the 31st of March, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados said for her, the greatest tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic is the length of time children have been away from school.
I cannot imagine what it is like for those kids, especially those who've gone into new schools, who've not been able to settle, who've not been able to do anything. So I think we've heard the concerns, we've heard about the need for additional testing, we've heard about the need for ensuring great safety. There is nobody who wants more safety than us because we don't want to see any increase in cases. But I think we are agreed that we have to go back to school and that we need to be able to do so in a safe manner. That's why not all 100% of the school population is going back at the same time, but we're trying to do so in consultation with the teachers.
Dr. Laurette Bristol, Program Manager for Human Development within the CARICOM Secretariat, said that CARICOM has been monitoring the progress of school reopening to determine when the education sector can move forward with what she described as more normalized realities.
There are so many moving parts as we navigate the COVID-19 challenge and its impact on education that, as is rightly due, because there are so many stakeholders that we need to protect when we think about reopening schools, while at the same time not increasing the loss of learning gap. So our member states have been navigating the reopening process very, very carefully. We have not been too hasty to rush into the face-to-face reality. We are attending very closely to guidelines being shared and given by the relevant ministries of health. And of course, we are working very closely with the relevant stakeholders, and in this instance, it would be the teachers, the parents, students, etc., particularly having close conversations with the unions.
Dr. Bristol is hopeful that with more vaccines arriving in the region and as member states roll out their vaccination programs, the education sector can return to a semblance of normalcy soon. Stay tuned to the CARICOM News Time for more on our conversation with Dr. Lowett Bristol on navigating school reopening amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Prime Minister of Grenada, Dr. Keith Mitchell, wants a reshaping of the way we think and more creative approaches to how we collect, produce, and disseminate data, especially as we prepare for the long-term impact of the coronavirus pandemic. He made the call at the annual meeting of the Paris 21 initiative held virtually on the 29th of March.
I speak with great sense of urgency when I continue to see this critical area not getting the attention it deserves, and our policies are not still being informed by credible data. The use of statistics relating to COVID-19 has clearly demonstrated how statistics can be used to strategically manage and mitigate the impact of the global pandemic.
Prime Minister Mitchell said the post-pandemic equation has to be informed by the production of good statistics, and he specially appealed to governments, development partners, and the private sector for more funding for statistics and for the regional strategy for the development of statistics.
Sustainable investment in the production of sound statistics should not be omitted from the post-COVID-19 pandemic equation. The post-pandemic solutions will require high-quality official statistics to adequately address the numerous health, economic, social, and other problems emanating from the pandemic, and which collectively slow our progress towards achieving the goals and targets of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Therefore, building resilience in a post-COVID-19 world will require a comprehensive assessment and examination of the impact of the pandemic, and that can only happen through the use of sound statistics.
Meanwhile, Grenada is among the countries in CARICOM that will be conducting its population and housing census this year. Barbados, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands are also preparing to conduct their census exercises this year. The Prime Minister said the exercise will certainly be a defining moment as the pandemic has provided additional rationale for the census since it can yield the evidence to enable positive development outcomes and build a more resilient country. Prime Minister Mitchell is the head of government responsible for statistics in the CARICOM quasi-cabinet. He is also a champion of statistics in the Caribbean. For more stories, you can log on to the CARICOM news site at today.caricom.org or the CARICOM website at caricom.org. Like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. Be safe and see you next time.